This is Left Voices for Monday, April 14th, 2014. I'm Andrea Sears. Tonight,
this is an extraordinarily important moment for the people of El Salvador. This is the most powerful person in the country, apart from the president. And tens of thousands of people, innocent women, men, and children, died under his watch.
A move toward justice for torture, assassinations, and massacres in El Salvador. A judge in the Justice Department's Executive Office of Immigration Review has ordered that former Salvadoran Defense Minister Jose Guillermo Garcia be deported from the United States for his assistance and participation in some of the worst human rights atrocities committed during that country's civil war. Garcia, now 81, served as defense minister from 1979 to 1983. He was granted political asylum in the United States in 1990 and has been living in Miami. In his 66-page ruling, Judge Michael Horn said Garcia had, quote, fostered and allowed to thrive an institutional atmosphere in which the Salvadoran armed forces preyed upon defenseless civilians under the guise of fighting a war against communist subversives, end quote. The ruling was issued in February, but was just made public last Friday in response to a Freedom of Information Act request from the New York Times. Pamela Merchant, executive director of the Center for Justice and Accountability, says the deportation order is significant for several reasons.
One is this is the second time the U.S. government has gone after a high-ranking former government official in this way to seek to remove them from this country for human rights abuses. The other case was General Vitas Casanova, who was also in the Salvadoran military at the same time and was the vice minister of defense. The other thing is it's an incredibly significant moment for the people of El Salvador because many of the abuses that Judge Horn links to General Garcia are signature emblematic abuses for which no one's been held to account in El Salvador, like the killing of Archbishop Oscar Romero, the El Mosoto massacre, where 1,000 civilians were killed, and the killing of the 4 churchwomen are some of the most famous of those events.
What was his role as Minister of Defense in these assassinations and massacres?
Well, what the court found is that as Minister of Defense, General Garcia had the greatest power and authority in El Salvador. The entire military, the Army, the Navy, reported to him, as did the security forces, so the Treasury Police and the National Police. And what this decision finds is that as the top person in all of this, he knew or should have known that all these abuses were happening. And the decision goes through in sharp detail to describe how he would have known and that he should have taken steps to stop it. For example, in the case of the El Mosoto massacre, where almost 1,000 citizens were killed, the bodies weren't buried. They were left out in the streets. In the capital of El Salvador, prisoners were tortured and then their bodies were dumped on the streets. There's no way that General Garcia didn't know that these abuses were happening and that they were happening by troops under his command. And that's the theory of the prosecution.
You had a witness, Dr. Juan Romagoza, who testified at this hearing. What was his experience?
Dr. Romagoza's story is actually a very tragic story. He was a doctor in El Salvador and was treating prisoners as they came out of prison. I mean, he was one of the few doctors that wasn't intimidated and afraid to treat people. And he was targeted because of that. He was arrested and tortured for 22 days. Death threats, electric shocks, asphyxiation. And one of the things they did is they shot him in his arm in a certain way so he could never do surgery again. He came to the United States a long time ago and received asylum, but before he even received asylum, he was living in Dolores Park here in San Francisco under a false name because it was so dangerous for him to be sent back to El Salvador. And he didn't give up hope for justice. So he ended up starting a health clinic in Washington, D.C., and becoming quite established here. and became involved in litigation against General Garcia back in 1999 when the Center for Justice and Accountability filed a case against Garcia and then General Vitas Casanova on behalf of Dr. Juan Ramagosa, Carlos Mauricio, and Neris Gonzalez. And the other part of this story is that we filed a civil suit and got this huge damages award against the generals, $56 million. But they still were here in the United States. They never paid any money because they claimed they had no money, and they were still here. In 2007, Dr. Ramagosa testified before a Senate subcommittee about this outrageous situation where the bad guys, the people responsible for his torture, were still here in the United States. And now, finally, all these years later, there's this removal order against Garcia.
How did people like Jose Guillermo Garcia and Vitas Casanova end up in the United States as residents?
Well, it's a good question, but at the time, they were our allies. It was the Cold War era. The United States had this position that if communism was a worse threat than human rights abuses, in the case of General Garcia, he was granted asylum here, because he said it was too dangerous for him to go back to El Salvador, which is, of course, apocryphal. But it's not just bad guys and human rights abusers from El Salvador who've settled in the United States. It's also from Haiti, from Somalia, from Honduras, Ecuador. We have a history of granting asylum to some of the worst human rights abusers out there.
Well, the worst of these abuses that were under the control of Garcia happened in 1980, 1981. This was almost 35 years ago. Why has it taken so long to at least achieve this level of recognition and potentially justice down the line?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, part of the reason is that until the war ended in El Salvador, it was too dangerous for anybody to come forward and to seek justice. The other thing is the laws have been changing in this country, and our ability to bring these cases have changed. The fact that there hasn't been any accountability in El Salvador has to do with the amnesty law there. So the ultimate endgame would be to fix the laws in El Salvador so there could really be an accounting there. So part of this is the wheels of justice move very slowly. It's been relatively recently that the U.S. government has started prosecuting human rights abusers and going after them, even in this context, which is just a removal case. It's not a prosecution. Part of that was due to Senator Durbin and a change in the climate in Washington. But I guess the short answer is there's many reasons why it takes so long, but it's extraordinarily important to keep the hope alive and to keep these cases moving forward so the truth can be told about what happened in El Salvador 30 years ago.
As you said, this is not a trial. This is a removal order. He can now be removed from the United States, and there is an amnesty law in El Salvador. Where can justice be found at this point?
Well, there's more to this story because he still can appeal this decision. The removal order was entered against Vitas Casanova 2 years ago, and his case is still up on appeal. So where can justice be found? I mean, this is some measure of justice. The truth is being told. All the years of the Salvadoran military trying to cover all of this up is changing. We're very hopeful that the amnesty will be repealed in our lifetimes in El Salvador. It's not complete justice yet, but this is an extraordinarily important moment for the people of El Salvador. This was the most powerful person in the country, apart from the president. And tens of thousands of people, innocent women, men, and children, died under his watch.
Pamela Merchant is Executive Director of the Center for Justice and Accountability. This has been Left Voices for Monday, April 14th, 2014. You can help support this experiment in independent journalism by visiting our website at www.leftvoices.net and following the Ways to Support Left Voices link at the top of the page. Join us again tomorrow for more news and information from a progressive perspective. I'm Andrea Sears for leftvoices.net.